Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to tonight's conversation. And my name is Hedda Kraus Sjögren. I was formerly the Counselor for Cultural Affairs at the Embassy of Sweden for 4 years, and I sadly returned to Sweden in March. And this evening's conversation and performance is a collaboration between the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and the Swedish Embassy. And without much further ado, I will leave the word and the screen to the Swedish ambassador, Håkan Juholt, to give us a few introductory remarks. Håkan, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Hedda. And I want you to know that you are deeply missed here in South Africa, both by us Swedes at the embassy, but also among South Africans. Dear friends, the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundation of civilization. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust will always hold universal meaning. Soon, the survivors will no longer be with us. At the same time, anti-Semitism is growing around the world. In January 2020, the Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven extended an invitation to heads of state and government, researchers, experts, and civil society representatives from around 50 countries to participate in the Malmö International Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating. Anti-Semitism, remember, react. The purpose of the forum is to jointly take concrete steps forward in the work on Holocaust remembrance and the fight against anti-Semitism. The Holocaust shall never be forgotten. Our fight against this anti-Semitism shall never cease. And we can and we must together do so much more in this regard. Violent anti-Semitism and hatred did not end with the Holocaust and are on the rise. This anti-Semitic violence and Holocaust denial are a threat to liberal, democratic societies of today. This hatred exists in most countries, including my own Sweden, in extreme right-wing groups, in parts of the left, and in Islamist environments. It appears in form of conspiracy theories on social media and the denial and the distortion of Holocaust, human rights abuses by the Israeli state against Palestinians are used as cover for hatred of Jews everywhere. We can see this among adults and children who fled to Sweden from countries where hatred of Jews is fed by schools and state propaganda. And we in Sweden, we are deeply concerned about this. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is a responsibility for all of us, for you and for me. Those who want a world where everyone is treated with dignity and humanity must stand up, raise their voices. And no one of us can run away from that responsibility. The Malmö Forum is an important international mobilization for Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. And I'm so thankful that we have this joint seminar today. And I hope that the discussions will be successful, fruitful, and strengthen our cooperation for human rights and dignity, because Sweden and South Africa, we share the same values. Our constitutions and our mindset when it comes to human rights are very equal. So we can do so much more together. Thank you, and I wish you a very successful, productive seminar.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the passionate speech. We are now going to head into today's program, and we have titled it Creating a Memorial Museum in the 21st Century. And what will follow here tonight is a conversation between the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Tali Nates, and Ingrid Lomfors, the former director of the Forum for Living History in Sweden, distinguished in these areas of creating new museums and centers around questions that concern the Holocaust and genocide. And the context for this conversation is both the Malmö Forum that the ambassador mentioned that will start in a couple of weeks here in Sweden. And also the fact that Sweden, contrary to South Africa, has not to this day a museum or a memorial for the Holocaust, and will institute one as of next year, July 2022. And that work has been going on for some time. And as we see that the last witnesses and the last survivors of the Holocaust are leaving us, the questions have come more to the fore over the last few years also in Sweden. So the conversation that we will have tonight will move around these questions. How do you create a memorial museum, a memorial place? How do you work with the memory of the Holocaust in different ways? And how do you also incorporate other aspects like music and the arts into a museum of the 21st century? So our two distinguished speakers tonight are Ingrid Lomfors, as I mentioned, and Tali Nates. Ingrid is also an associate professor of history at Gothenburg University. And she's also the former chairman of the Swedish delegation to IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and of the Per Anger Prize. She's the former director of the City Museum of Gothenburg, former project manager for collecting testimonies to the Holocaust and to the Holocaust at the Nordic Museum in Sweden. She's the author of several books, articles on the Swedish role in the Second World War and its relation to the Holocaust, and primarily, perhaps, the rescue of Jewish children to Sweden in 1938 and 1939. And she will speak more about this as we come into the conversation. And Tali Nates is, as I mentioned previously, the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. She's also the chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. She is also a historian who lectures internationally on Holocaust education, genocide prevention, reconciliation, and human rights. Tali has presented numerous international conferences, including in the United Nations, and published articles and contributed chapters to many books. Among them is God, Faith, and Identity from the Ashes, Reflections of Children and Grandchildren of the Holocaust Survivors. And Tali is born to a family of Holocaust survivors. Her father and uncle were saved by Oskar Schindler, and her other family was not saved, was murdered. So, Tali and Ingrid, I would like to begin by welcoming you to this conversation in Sweden and South Africa. Hello, how are you tonight?
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Hedda.
Thank you so much, Hedda. It's good to be in the conversation.
Thank you. And I would like to begin by asking both of you to actually tell the listeners and viewers a little bit more about yourselves, how you've come to be engaged with the memory and the history of the Holocaust. And Tali, let's direct this question first to you.
Thank you. As you said when you introduced me, I was born to this history. I was born to a father that was a survivor but did not speak. And it's interesting when someone does not speak and actually you don't have clear information in front of you. I, as a child, became very curious and really wanted to know and tried to know in different ways. He sadly died when I was young. I was a young teenager when I lost my father. But my uncle that survived with him was the speaking one. So let me just share 2 or 3 pictures when I'm telling you this story, because I do want to make a connection to memory through these pictures. And the pictures I want to share is the memorial, the very striking new memorial in Belgium that was opened in 2004. I was actually there with my family in that memorial. And that is where my father's family was murdered. They came from this town, Novi Tag, and they were murdered there in August of 1942. So I did not know it growing up. So I wanted to know this memory. I wanted to access this memory. And I only accessed it through pictures that came later on in life. My father never had photos of the family, but suddenly these drawings emerged in the family that somehow went to America, to some cousins, and the memory sort of came later on. And I found out about my grandmother, Leonora. I do not have a picture of her, but I did find out about my aunts, Hela and Tsila Turner, that were murdered in Belgium. I am named, my second name is after Hela. Helen is my second name. So sort of puzzles of memory. I sort of built the memory of the Holocaust as I was growing up. As you mentioned, my father and my uncle Moses or Marion and Henrik Turner were saved by Oskar Schindler. This is page 10 of that list. And I marked their names. And again, that was a childhood memory because they used to go and visit Oskar Schindler when he used to come to Israel. I was born in Israel, moved to South Africa when I was already about to get married. And again, I grew up and learned more about these memories. A puzzle piece that is really important is the fact that a German, a member of the Nazi party, saved my father's life. So that piece of memory was really important for me growing up because I always learned that people have choices, that you cannot look at the history in black and white, that you cannot put people in boxes. So from very young childhood, that was very, very clear to me. And finally, when I connected to creating the museum in Johannesburg, and this is a photo of me taken by a good friend, photographer John O'David, while we were building the skeleton of the building, he asked me to pose with a picture of my father. And you see me there, and the idea was that we are creating a building that is full of stories, but full of memories. So it is really about memory, education, lessons. It is about history of the Holocaust, but it is beyond. It's the choices of humanity. It is human rights. It's all that. And I think for me, all these pieces of the puzzles came together to create a very strong need to create a space for dialogue, a space that we can speak to each other, but in the 21st century. I think that was incredibly important in my journey to creating the center. And just finally, we only opened to the public really in March of 2019. So it was a long journey from 2008, the creation, moving to the building in 2016, and then opening in 2019.
Thank you very much for sharing with us, Charlie. And Ingrid, would you tell us also a little bit about your background and your journey into your work? Thank you.
Thank you, Hedda, and thanks for having me on this conversation with you and Tali. And Tali, I had no idea that you and I have such similar background. But first, so I'm a Swedish historian, and until recently I was the head of the Living History Forum, which is a Swedish governmental authority assigned to do kind of informal educational and cultural work on the Holocaust. And at present, I am working on some of my own projects related to Jewish history, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. And I do have a personal connection to the subject. My mother came to Sweden as a Jewish refugee child from Nazi Vienna, Austria, in 1939. So in that sense, I belong to what is called the second generation, just as Tali. And I was also growing up in silence. My mother was unable to talk about her past. I think she was actually traumatized about what happened to her and to her family, because she lost all her family, which became known only in the 1950s, actually. I slowly, just as Tali described before, I got some pieces here and the pieces there, and it was like a puzzle, and it's still a puzzle in a way. So I searched for my own personal story for many years. And that personal search slowly turned into a more professional and academic search for a larger narrative and a more scientific context. It wasn't my idea from the beginning. I wanted to do something else in life, but this was waiting for me in a way. And since then, it was many years now, I have devoted my professional life to the memory of the Holocaust and how it can be understood and preserved through work of education, research, and culture. By the way, I think I have a picture of my mother, Pnina. See if you can see it. There she is. Here you have Nina, and it's actually from an exhibition that I produced just before the pandemic, actually, and I put her in the front. It's not about her, but it's about the 500 children who were rescued to Sweden in 1939. So I've done extensive research on that particular group. Thank you for showing it. Thank you.
Thank you. And also I'd like to mention to those who are watching and listening that towards the end of the session, we'll also be able to take questions through the chat. So if you have questions, hold on to them or tap them into the chat, and we'll get back to it towards the end. So now Sweden and South Africa can, for some people, seem to be a little bit on the, you can say, the periphery of the Second World War and the periphery of the Holocaust. The war didn't actually happen on Swedish soil, on South African soil. And I'm thinking that has perhaps a little bit of a particular, how can I say, meaning or weight when you work with a memorial museum. So this is something that I'm a bit curious about, and I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about it, and also because Sweden and South Africa seem to be very far away and very different entry points into the history, maybe or maybe not. So perhaps if I begin now with you, Ingrid, with your perspectives, would you like to talk to us a little bit about what it might mean to be on the margins or the periphery of the history and the historical event of the Second World War and the genocide and Holocaust?
Well, it's true that Sweden, unlike many other European countries, was on the what you call periphery or margins of the Holocaust. You know, Sweden was declared as a neutral state with the purpose of not getting involved in the warfare and not supporting any of the fighting parties, of course. However, Swedish neutrality was controversial and was being discussed already during the war, and even more so during the post-war period. And that's because it's quite clear, it was clear then, it's very much clear now that violations of their neutrality took place. So you are in the margins, and yet you play a role, right? So what were the consequences of these violations and to be in the margin and still, you know, have a role? Did it affect the military battle, for example? Did it help Nazi Germany to occupy our neighboring country, Norway? Did it have any effect on the deportation of Jews to the death camps and killing sites? I think these are real crucial questions that we have to continue to explore in order to, you know, to understand the full complexity on the Swedish position during the Holocaust. Not only for the sake of research and history writing, but more so for our, I would say, national self-understanding, self-image, and our understanding of our identity as a society and as a people. So it's very interesting how you talk about, you know, center, the periphery in this context. I think it's a good question, and it should be explored much more.
Would you, I mean, when you say explored much more, do you want to elaborate just a little bit more on how that could, you know, just one example maybe?
I think, you know, in Sweden we had for some time 2 schools of history, of historian. One was, I would say, the older generation of historians, even though I'm old myself now, but 20, 30 years ago, were very defensive and always wanted to, you know, to protect the Swedish strategy and policy during the war and the and the position of being in the marginal and being a neutral state, whereas the younger generation of historians are more into exploring the moral dilemmas of being in the marginal, of looking into these violations. Where did they take place? In what areas? What effect did it have? And we are not finished with that. It goes on because it's a huge, huge question. And I think that the term neutrality is still something that we avoid. And I think it also has some relevance to today. Of course, we still talk about, should we be a part of NATO or not? Are we neutral or we're not? So it's really could be at least an explosive political issue.
And Tali, from your perspective and your double perspective of Southern Africa and being the daughter of a survivor, and can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this concept or this idea of the margin or the periphery?
Yeah, it's really interesting idea, the idea of the margins, because South Africa, of course, was part of the Allies. They were fighting, many African countries were fighting, as part of the Allies, and some were on the side of the Axis because they were under Vichy control in West Africa. And actually, there were even concentration camps in areas like Senegal and Niger. And we're not talking about it. These are the marginalities that were silent for many, many years. South Africa, the closest that the Holocaust came to South Africa was actually the deportation of 1,580 Jews from that were escaping the Reich with Eichmann's support, with the Germans' approval, in September of 1940, from Austria, from Germany, from the Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, Danzig, and so on. They were stopped by, they tried to get by ships to British-controlled Palestine, stopped by the British, deported to their colony in Mauritius, which is only, as you know, 3.5 hours away from us in the Indian Ocean, and kept in a prison camp for almost 5 years on Mauritius. 126 of them died, and maybe let me show you the picture of the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Mauritius, 1940 to 1945, and that is the closest that Jewish survivors from Germany came to South Africa. They were released only in August of 1945. And that history is only explored in the last 6 years. There was total silence, some books, some reunions of those detainees, but only with the opening of a memorial center in the end of 2014, 2015, right next to the cemetery in St. Martin, in the area of Beaubassin. So it's close to Port Louis, the capital center of Mauritius. Suddenly this story came. And the story of South Africa in the war is barely discussed in the textbooks. The fact that our troops fought in Italy, or that the 60 Squadron of the South African Air Force took the famous reconnaissance photographs of Auschwitz and of Birkenau. These were South Africans. We all know the pictures, but we don't talk about the pilots that took those pictures. So there was a lot to try and connect to. And that is where you need to think about when you create a museum or a memorial in the margins. What stories does that memorial need to tell? Does it tell the story of German Jews that stayed in Germany, or Polish Jews that stayed in Poland? Or does it tell stories of people that arrived in South Africa, in the 1930s and escaped the Reich, or people that managed to come after, about connections to Europe, for example, to Lithuania and to Latvia, because many in the South African Jewish community came from those communities, and what happened to families that they left behind. So those are the histories that you need to think about telling. And finally, because today is the second day of the 80th anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre that happened on the 29th and the 30th of September 1940. So today exactly is 80 years to this mass killing. I just want to make a connection to the fact that most Jews that came from Eastern Europe did not die in Auschwitz. So we cannot just tell the story of Auschwitz, because they were killed in Kiev, in Babi Yar, or they were killed in Lithuania, in Ponar, or in Latvia, in Riga, in Rombula, and so on. So there is a different story that needs to be told when you look at it from South Africa.
And at Forum for Living History, you've also worked extensively with the idea of, or the concept of the bystander standard, which is also in a way this idea that you place yourself on the margin or on the periphery, and you look in or you look on. Would you say then, Ingrid, I mean, Tali is talking about South Africa's engagement in the Second World War, and you were starting to talk a little bit about it before, about Sweden, but would you say that Sweden was a bystanding country? And how would that, how can we sort of reflect on that in a memorial situation or a museum site? Would you talk a little bit about that? And
first of all, I totally agree with Tali. I think it's so important to use your own national history as a starting point while creating a museum. And you are so right about the fact that the Holocaust did not only take place in Auschwitz, it took place all over Europe, actually. Also in my neighboring country, Norway, where the whole Jewish population were being deported. And I often think about the role that we played, my country played, in this regard, since we allowed German troops to pass through Sweden to Norway and also to Finland, by the way. That's one example of the transgression that I described before, or the violation of our neutrality. So we sometimes use the term bystander, as you did, Hedda, although it's being reevaluated by most scholars these days. But we were not in the center, and we were not a part of the warfare itself, but we do play a role. And as I said before, Sweden had a policy of neutrality, trying hard to navigate to keep the country out of the warfare. But this pragmatic political position demanded some, I would say, severe compromises in order to please, especially the Germans, by trading with Germany, by allowing German troops through our territorium, by accepting censorship of our media, introducing anti-Jewish regulations, so on and so forth. So being a bystander, came with a price, and especially a moral price. And talking about morality, I think it tends to stay with us for a very long time. For example, at the Living History Forum, where I used to work, we invite young people to discuss what it means to be a bystander in the past and what it means to be a bystander today as a nation and as individual, because I think it's important for especially young people to discuss moral dilemmas. We all face dilemmas in our life and also as a nation, and asks them to respond. How would you do if you were in the same situation? Do you find yourself in a similar situation today? I think that these are questions that can feed into a process of awareness and interest in the past and in the complexity of being a human being today. So I think when it comes to the position of being in the margins or being a bystander, as I said before, that it's such a complex position to be in. But I also want to say something else with regard to what Tali mentioned before. I think it's so important to, when we create a museum, not to copy what museums are in other countries, because there is a risk. And I think you see it sometimes when you travel around the world and you visit a Holocaust museum. There is a risk that we will end up in the same kind of narrative. And it's so important that we show the variety and diversity of stories, and that we include so many voices and stories, because that's the huge loss. In that huge loss, we have so many different kind of people, stories, cultures, languages, and it's so important to display that in a museum.
And Talia, at the center in Johannesburg, you also work, I think, rather extensively, but maybe you can talk about it, with partners in Rwanda and other places in the world. So can you talk a little bit about, because it connects directly, I think, to what you were saying now, Ingrid, about the specificity of where you are in the world and how it connects to the context more closely around you. So would you say, would you elaborate a little bit about why are you doing that? How did that come about? What does it mean in the context of the Holocaust and the survivors that you also work so much with at the center?
Oh. So the decision we made, and that is exactly what Ingrid is saying. You have to make a decision, and it is a process. Luckily for us, we had time. Sometimes you need time. When you do it too quickly, you make many times mistakes. We had the time to think what should be in, what should not be in, what connections do we make? So if we are talking about Holocaust and genocide in South Africa, in Africa, what are the connections that we are going to make? So I spoke a little bit about connections to the war, for example, in Africa. Talking about North Africa, because the Holocaust and the Second World War did not happen only in Europe. All of North Africa was conquered, almost. I mean, stopped at El Alamein. I mentioned already West Africa, I mentioned already Mauritius. But how do you make also further connections? So how do you connect to our own difficult history, not only of apartheid, but of colonialism? A history of racism, history of crimes against humanity. How do you make all those connections? And how do you not fall into the trap of your coming out of the exhibition and we are kumbaya, we are all living together, everyone is happy, we conquered evil, we learned, we are now good, which is, of course, not true. So how do you make connections to today and to issues of today? So again, let me just share a few images just to make it what we did. So for example, you can see in this image that is that we connected to apartheid South Africa, to the human rights in the world, Declaration of Human Rights. We connected to Africa and the Holocaust. Then we connected to other genocides. The story of the coining of the word genocide, the story of Raphael Lemkin, the story of the genocide of the Herero and Nama in next door Namibia, before there was a word, because that happened in 1904. And shamefully, South Africans do not know about Namibia. Namibia, or Southwest Africa, before the German Southwest Africa, from 1916 to 1990 was controlled by South Africa. Apartheid was also in Namibia, but we don't talk about it. So we are bringing those stories and those histories in. We are bringing stories from across the world to make those connections. So Herero and Nama, Armenia, Rwanda, the questions of never again. You have to bring it, but you have to bring it with a question mark, because or else it's dogma, it's not helpful. So you need to poke and you need to invite connections, and you needed to make connections to, Ingrid spoke about bystanders or bystanding. You need to make connections of, so what did South Africa do during the genocide in Rwanda? In April of 1994, we stood and voted. I, a daughter of survivor, in April of 1994, cared more about the democratic process and about us being in peace and voting for Nelson Mandela for our first democratic president. 3.5 hours away from me, there was a genocide happening exactly to children, mothers, fathers like my father, and they coined, the penny did not drop until months later when survivors started to come to South Africa. And suddenly I was absolutely horrified that I, the second generation, historian, did not make the connection in real time. So those connections need to be done quickly, and you need to poke, you need to ask questions, and you need to do it through exhibitions and through museums. I think safe spaces that allow people to talk about these very difficult issues.
And of course, you talk about them in many different ways, through exhibitions, but also through, what's the word in English that I'm looking for? Gestalt. How do you put a body or a feeling or an experience on these very, very, very difficult and topics that sometimes we are comfortable staying in the academic or theoretical part of it, but sometimes you also want to bring in other aspects. And Tali, can you tell us a little bit about how you have been working with that in the museum? And also we will in the program actually introduce some of the performers that you've been working with.
So for me, creating a museum in the 21st century is also about not creating the old style museum where all displays are, I don't know, 1.5 meters tall on the wall, the book on the wall style, that you walk comfortably, you do not really move your heads or your body, you don't engage your senses, you just read and listen. I mean, Ingrid said it, the stories are painful and emotional, and you can of course put them on large photographs and on stories and testimonies and quotes and so on. So I'm not putting down museums, but I believe that in the 21st century, our students, young people, but also other people, would like to learn in different ways. And some of the ways are through the arts. Some of the ways is through concentrating on poetry, reading a poem, you know, can be really interesting. Maybe looking at let me maybe share one poem that we have in our garden, and do it in more than one language. So do it in English, in Hebrew, in Kenya, Rwanda. And this is a Dan Pagis poem. He was a Holocaust survivor himself, a poet, died in 1986. His poem written in pencil in the sealed railway car, about Adam and Eve, of course, about the first murder, if you wish. Here in this carload, I am Eve with Abel, my son. If you see my other son, Cain, son of man, tell him that I, and then you can repeat again the poem. And we really engage with the arts in a very, very intensive way. So there are drawings. And please, if people would like to go into our website, in our exhibition, you can see we have a lot of virtual tours that you can engage with, but you can look at the art, children arts, for example, in Theresienstadt. You look at art in ghettos, in camps, poems. In every room, you have poems. Music. We have a wonderful soundscape that I will put in the chat. The connection to, and that is let me just share the screen and show you. That is a piece called Remember Zachor Ibuka, composed by Philip Miller, a renowned composer. And he is, and I'm going to just play a little bit, just a minute, but while I'm talking. Sorry, I'm going to do one more try. Sorry. Yes. So you can listen to the sound of the shofar. You will also hear survivors from Rwanda and from the Holocaust singing childhood songs, sharing testimonies. Philip Miller is talking about it. And in our opening, all the survivors came together that workshopped this piece and spoke about their experience of the Remember Zachor Ibuka. And the whole workshop process was unbelievable. It was really powerful. You can find much more about our exhibition on our website, and please do go and engage with that. But you hear here the sounds.
Amagambo twavuganaga simenye kwari bwoganyuma.
O je kleine lichterlach, je dat zelt geschichterlach, meiselach von am Morgen. Je dat zelt und Muttigkeit, Heldigkeit und Gurigkeit, meiselach von at soul.
I will stop here. The piece is long, is about 14 minutes long. It is on a soundscape in our reflection garden. And that is also part of the new museum. So when you create a new museum in the 21st century, it's to think about the arts, but also to think about, do you concentrate on life or on death, the moment of death? Do you tell the stories? What stories do you tell? Do you tell women's stories as well as men's stories? There are so many levels that you need to look at. And one of the most amazing process was to work with musicians, and specifically with one musician, a very gifted young musician in Johannesburg, Lee Noodleman Sussman. And Hedda, I don't know if you want me to introduce Lee. So Lee Noodleman Sussman worked with us and allowed us to include 6 of the songs that she recorded to connect us to the old world, to connect us to life, to the communities, rather than just to the moment of death. Lee will perform a song with musician Farrell Roth, and will tell us about the song that she will perform now. She will also perform again later on. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tali, and thank you so much for hosting us. It's very, very special to be here. So this song, which is part of the exhibition at the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Johannesburg, is called Oifen Pripachik. It was written by Mark Warshawski in the late 1800s, and it gained such popularity that it's now known as a folk song. I'm going to just give you the translation. It says, "On the hearth a fire burns, and the room is warm. A rabbi teaches small children the Hebrew alphabet. Repeat, children, and repeat again the sounds of the letters. The rabbi very encouragingly says, children, whoever learns fastest will receive a flag. But the final verse of the song says, when you grow older, children, you will realize for yourselves how many tears are hidden in these letters and how much pain. Repeat, children, and repeat again the sounds of the letters." Oifen Pripachik brennt a fire on in Stobes Haus, und der Rebel lernt kleine Kinderlich, dem alle Bös, und der Rebel lernt kleine Kinderlich, dem alle Bös. Sitze Kinderlich, gedenk Schäterje, was sie lernen du. Sucht je noch einmal und hacke noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Sucht je noch einmal und hacke noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Lernt Kinder mit groß Geschick, also ich sage euch an, wird gehabt von euch kennen in Wren, der Bock und davon. Und der Rebel lernt kleine Kinderlich, dem alle bös. Seid ihr kinderlich, gedenk Schäterje, was sie lernen du. Sucht ihr noch einmal und hacke noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Sucht ihr noch einmal und hacke noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Als ihr wird Kinder alten werden, wird ihr allein verstehen, wie viel in die Äußers liegen drin und wie viel gewinn. Und der Rebel lernt kleine Kinderlich, dem alle bös. Sitze kinderlich, gedenk Schäterje, was sie lernen du. Sucht je noch einmal und hacke noch einmal, kommet alle vor. Sucht je noch einmal und hacke noch einmal, kommet alle vor.
Thank you so much, Farrell and Lee. This absolutely beautiful, and I'm lucky, and I think we're all lucky, because we will hear from you again in a little bit. So, Charlie, this kinds of performances and storytelling forms part of the work that you do at the center. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's important. It's important to bring the layer, the layering of the museum. So, of course, the stories, the quotes, the films, the testimonies, the multimedia, all that is very, very important. But listening to Lee, singing a song that is a beloved song, bring the life to and the emotion, I think, which is important when you look at a history that is becoming removed. It's 80 years later. And I think you mentioned before about the fact that sadly the survivors are passing on, and we lost many survivors in the Johannesburg community during COVID and in the last few years. So how do we do those layering? So maybe I will just again show you the room where this is happening. So you have lots of layers. You have testimonies, you have photographs, you have projections of the meaning of what is the loss. And we actually quoted from the Mendelssohn book, The Lost, about when genocide happened. It's not only the people that are murdered that are lost, it's about the children that will never be born. It's about the art that will never be made, the music that will never be made, the medicine that will never be, invented, and so on. And then we have a film, and then we have the music, and a map, and so much more that you can access, and multimedia, and so on. So I think this is the kind of layering that we are trying to do in each one of the rooms. And the same is in the Rwandan space. So you will have the same kind of layering, but of course bringing the more specific Rwandan stories into the fore.
And also in Sweden, the Jewish community has been affected by COVID, and the last survivors are leaving us, and the last witnesses. And I know also the Forum for Living History has been, I guess a word is mandated by the Swedish government to collect memorials and so on. And Ingrid, I'm wondering if in response to some of the things that Tali is describing here on how the center in Johannesburg works, and with the collection of artifacts and memories, if you can say something about that from your perspective, from the Swedish perspective.
First of all, thanks for this beautiful music, and thanks for being so engaged in the arts. I think it's so crucial to have that perspective of that layering, and also this interdisciplinary approach to history. We are receptive in such a different way. Some people like to read from textbooks, and others like to be engaged in music. And I think that the dialogue between now and then, and between people, and between various forms of formal and informal education is so important to have with when you establish a new museum. And it's such a chance for Sweden to establish from the ground a new house, a new museum. we should send a delegation to Johannesburg. No, I think that the personal stories is, of course, number one when it comes to telling about the Holocaust, to listen to voices and to see artifacts and to put the artifacts in a personal context, not only a personal context, also in historical context, but to see perhaps a diary or a bottom or a cup. I remember myself, I was in charge of collecting testimonies back in the 1990s. And I remember a woman coming to me with a cup, and she was telling me how this cup saved her life, because she was on a death march from Auschwitz to Germany, and it was winter and snow, and there were no food, and she could melt snow in that cup, and that's how she survived. So of course, every little item, object can be of such a great importance. And also one should remember, as Tali mentioned before, that there were also art during the Holocaust. First of all, there were artists being in the ghettos and in the camps, and they continue to create art and music, great music. For example, in Theresienstadt, you have these children drawings and so on. And I think it's so important to tell these stories and to display it, but also in a way where you can interact with questions of today. I think that's so important, not to make history static, but to make it more alive. And that's what I think the Living History do, for example. But I think that the new museum will also do it. I'm sure, I'm confident about that.
Hedda, you are muted.
Thank you. So Ingrid, would you say that now with the museum and with the chairmanship of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that Sweden will assume in January with the Malmö Forum, do you think there is a particular kind of shift in Sweden in the perspective of and the discourse, and if so, how can that play into, do you think, into a new museum? Can you say something about that?
Well, I see from an historiographical point of view, there are always shifts, right? Because memory and memorialization is an ongoing process. And there have been shifts in the past. And if I can just mention a few of them, and the reason behind the shift, because we should remember that this issue of creating a new museum is it's kind of a new issue, because for many years we didn't talk about the Holocaust at all, and suddenly we have this awareness coming to us that it's important. And I think one reason for this shift is actually time. Remember that right after the war, Europe was in a ruin, and the focus was on rebuilding society and healing the wounds and all that. And with time, you tend to see things a bit from a distance, and you see it clearer, and perhaps also it's less painful. So I think time is one shouldn't underestimate time. And I want to mention two other things that can explain the big shift that I want to mention two reasons to the major shift that took place in the 1990s, because that's a crucial decade with this regard. And one is war on the Balkans in the 1990s, it was because it was really a wake-up call for Europe, because we as Europeans had been lulled into the notion that there couldn't be no more war or genocide in Europe again. And yet it did happen in the heart of Europe. And people said, oh, have we not learned anything? Have we already forgotten what happened during the Holocaust? And that insight got several projects started, and we can see the fruit of them today, actually. And then I want to mention another reason to the shift, and that's Holocaust denial and distortion. We saw it coming in the public sphere in the 1990s, especially in the raising of a neo-Nazi movement. And the lesson from that, I think, is, you know, if you pretend that the Holocaust never happened, or if it has little or no importance in the curriculum or culture, etc., then you provide those who are denials with an open space. And history can so easily be rewritten if nobody's there to protect it. And what is interesting, and I remember it so well myself, was the reaction from the survivors. Because for the first time, they stepped forward as a collective to confront this distortion of memory. And they organized themselves, and they went out to schools. And their contribution to this shift is absolutely enormous. And I could go on and on to mention more reasons for the shift, but my conclusion is that you have shifts going on all the time, because it is a process, right? And suddenly you think that, oh, every stone is turned now and we know everything. No, because then something else happens in the world, and you have to start perhaps all over again. And I think it's important to look at history not in a static way, but in a dynamic way. History is taking place now.
And I would also now just like to remind everyone who's listening that you can tap in questions to Ingrid and Tali. And of course, both Ingrid and Tali are also on the advisory board for the Malmö Forum. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat. Tali, would you like to comment further on what Ingrid was just talking about? Would you like to add?
Yeah, if you don't mind, before we answering the excellent questions in the chat, just to say that, interestingly enough, there is a shift also on the African continent, and that is quite an interesting thing to see, that in few countries in Africa, the Holocaust is now compulsory in the school curriculum. South Africa was the first one in 2007. But Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast is now teaching about it. Rwanda is teaching about the Holocaust, and a few other countries are also part of a UNESCO pilot. So 6 countries, including Kenya, including Namibia, Zimbabwe, to teach the Holocaust and other genocides in their school curriculum. So there is much more interest, much more writing about it. Conferences are happening about Africa and the Holocaust. So there is an interest in discovering what was never spoken about West Africa, about North Africa, about Mauritius. There's interest to understand, when you speak about the Wannsee conference and the protocol that says all the countries and the Jews, are the African Jews also part of that under France? So there is a lot of interest to understand it and to make connections. So what is the most important, I think, is to make those connections to genocide in the continent, like Europe did with the former Yugoslavia. Here it's happening with Southwest Africa, Namibia, and Rwanda, but also with issues of today, What are the issues? Is it violent extremism that we need to look at? Is it democracy, the fragility of democracy? Is it silencing of women or gender? Is it ignoring people with disabilities, like, for example, the Life Esidimeni tragedy with the 144 people that died, people with disabilities that died in 2015 here in Johannesburg, and to make connections between history of the past and history today. And that is happening also in South Africa and the continent.
And here we have a question from Kevin, I think primarily to Ingrid. Let's see, did post-war revelations of the genocide cause any public formal or informal reassessment by the Swedish people of the national neutrality policy of 1939 to 1945?
I think that the question is yes and no at the same time. To some extent, there has been a reevaluation and there's been a critical approach, and research have shown a number of what I call violations of our neutrality that we didn't know of before. And that's very good. And we had maybe 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, an historical commission. It was part of a global investigation on when it came to Sweden, it was on trading with Nazi Germany. When it came to Switzerland, it was on hairless bank accounts. That issue started a whole global investigation on restitution, actually. And that was very, very healthy for Sweden to be part of that work. I think we looked at ourselves from a totally new perspective, and I think many people were so surprised by how engaged we were in actually in the Holocaust, because we traded with Nazi Germany, and we received gold for our iron that we exported. And that gold was, where did the German got the gold from? So there were huge issues. But at the same time, and that's why I answered no as well, I was part of that commission, by the way. I had this uneasy feeling that the commission wanted, and also from the government side, wanted to do the investigation just to get rid of it. You know, I remember our then Prime Minister said, let's turn every stone and let's, you know, clean the whole issue so we can be done with it and then continue. And that's not a good way of looking at history. You can never get rid of it, because history is something that you carry with you all the time. And I think that history, you know, can also be an asset. It's not a problem only, it can be an asset. It can help you to navigate in the future. So that's why I'm answering both yes and no to your question.
And Tali, you have a question also, I think.
Yes, to Ingrid. Ingrid, I'm very curious, following this, about how Sweden is telling itself the story of being the courageous, brave saviors of the Danish Jews, or, you know, or other such stories. Is there a narration also of righteousness that is there for over the years, and did this one changed as well and is researched?
Well, you know, I think, but that's my personal opinion, I think that Sweden had a very bad conscience after the war for being on the marginal and for being a bystander and not doing it enough, and for all these compromises with the Germans. So there was a very bad conscience. And after the war, there were some, there was a beginning of a discourse of building up a new image, a self-image of Sweden. And of course, we did great things during the war. We saved the Danish Jews, that's right. We sent Wallenberg to Budapest. It wasn't a Swedish initiative, but still he was Swedish, and he saved a lot of lives. We did good things, but we also did some really, really bad things. But we turned it into a good narrative because it fitted the notion of Sweden being a humanitarian superpower, which sticked with us for many, many years. And I can just give you one example. The white buses, for example, which is quite known all over the world. The white buses that went to Nazi Germany and liberated people and brought them to Sweden, right? For many years, for 50 years, people thought, and people still think, that the white buses with Count Bernadotte went to Nazi Germany to save the Jews. On the contrary, he did not save the Jews. He went there to save Danish and Norwegian prisoners. He had no intention of saving any Jews. The Jews who actually came with the white buses were a minority, and they happened to come on the buses not because of Count Bernadotte or Sweden, but for other reasons. And that story was with us for such a long time. So I think it's so important, that you have a construction of self-image, of a picture, and it's so important to deconstruct and to build it up again with new sources, with new perspectives, with new questions. And then you end up in a new picture, in a new self-understanding, a new self-image. And as I said before, I think it's so important that this work continues. It must go on and on because history is really dynamic.
Thank you very much. And now we also have a question about that. I think that refers a little bit to how you work with different aspects to bring in different aspects into the center, like arts, music, and so on. And of course, as having worked also in South Africa for a long time, I know artists both in Sweden and South Africa often struggle. So the question is about the artist situation really in the country. So here's the question. If you think the arts are important, how will the Holocaust Center treat artists? Artists in society, especially in South Africa, are often undermined or exploited or treated as window dressing. So I'll direct that first to you, Tali.
Absolutely, and especially during COVID-19, I think it's absolutely heartbreaking to see many of the theaters closing, art galleries struggling, and so on. Of course, we are in the end a museum of history. So how do you get the balance, and how do you include the arts, and how do you not marginalize the artist? And it's a very, very good question. And what we try to do is always incorporate, not only in the permanent exhibition, which I spoke about, but incorporate the arts in our programming. So, for example, theater pieces were performed many, many times in the center, from a piece about Sarajevo and the former Yugoslavia, to a piece about the Holocaust, a piece about the First World War and the South African troops that we did some years ago. And now we're working on another theater piece that hopefully we will partner soon. I can't tell too much, but we are working on a one-woman show to be seen at the center, because the theaters are closed. And and there is no spaces, safe spaces where theatre can be performed. The same with performances of music, that we had many, from Yiddish soirees to Rwandan music encounters, and of course film screenings and so on. But it is that balance. How do you not take the role of a theatre, or you're not becoming a artist in exhibition, you are still a historical exhibition, but feature the art within your walls.
We are reaching the end of this conversation this evening. So before we turn to final performance, I'd like to ask if you have any final comments, Tali or Ingrid. And I can also say that we're getting a lot of comments about the session as a whole, and how satisfying and interesting and fascinating it is. So thank you.
Well, thanks for arranging this talk, Hedda. And I think that talking and exchanging thoughts across countries and institutions is also a significant way to keep the memory alive. So thank you for hosting this seminar. And also for me, just great thanks. Ingrid, it was really wonderful to work with you in the Malmö Forum preparation. I look forward to meeting with you. And Hedda, we miss you in South Africa. It was wonderful to feel as if you are actually next door and you are still in South Africa, allowing us to have this, very interesting and important conversation, and featuring some of the music and the arts in the Museum of the 21st Century.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us tonight. It's been an honor, a pleasure, and also I've learned a lot this evening. We keep getting comments also in the chat, but I think I will just encourage everyone who's listening to stay tuned. And I know that the center, the Holocaust Center in Johannesburg, you do a lot of things online right now. So also for people who are in Sweden and Australia, you're able to access. And of course, there's lots of things happening right now in Sweden, apart from the Malmö Forum coming up. I also know that the Forum for Living History does a lot of activities online, and eventually we'll have the museum. We also have the Jewish Museum in Stockholm, for instance. That's just a few examples to take part of stories and exhibitions. So with that, I would like to introduce again Lee Nudelman-Sussman and Farrell Roth for a final performance. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much. A Yiddishist in South Africa once said to me, every time you sing a Yiddish song, you bring a Jewish soul back to life. And one of the songs that I feel this is most pertinent of is Rajinkis mit Mandlin, which means raisins and almonds. It was written by Abraham Goldfaden, again in the late 1800s. Goldfaden was the founder of modern Yiddish theatre, and he wrote this piece for an opera called Shalamus. It was his first Yiddish musical production, and it's a lullaby. And the lullaby says, beneath Yiddela's cradle is a young white goat. When it goes to market, so will you, to deal your raisins and almonds. But for now, hushaby, my son. And I think this just speaks of the history of the Jewish people, and it speaks to the present. It's a relic of the past, but also speaks to where the Jewish people are going in the future. And it's sung by a woman who, we learn in the song, is a widow of Zion, sitting alone in the temple, singing this lullaby to her son.
steht da klar weiß Ziegele. Das Ziegele ist gefahren handeln. Das wird sein dein Beruf. Rosenkäs mit Mandeln. Schlaf, Schädel, schlaf. In dem Beis Hamikdash in a Winkelcheder sitzt die Almone Poszen allein. Ihr ben Jochidelen weckt sie Kiseide und singt ihm zum Schlafen ein Liedele schön. Und jedes Wegele steht da klar weiß Ziegele. Das Ziegele ist gefahren handeln. Das wird sein dein Beruf. Rosenkäs mit Mandeln. Schlaf, Schädel, schlaf. Schlaf, Schädel, schlaf.
Thank you. Thanks so much.